Now, in a moment, I'm going to be joined by Wall Street Journal editor-at-large Gerard Baker, or as I like to call him, the Englishman in New York. But before I bring him in, there's been a lot of talk this week about the new American posture towards Europe, specifically in light of a new national security document that delivers some tough love to the continent. And while a lot of critics have accused Trump of dissing Europe or cutting it off or leaving the continent to the tender mercies of Vladimir Putin, I think maybe not so much. Because when you actually look at what this document is saying, you realize that this is not so much a Dear John letter as an intervention. The fact is that Europe is in the midst of a cultural and economic and military crisis. And this document from the United States is a wake-up call. In fact, it says quite explicitly in the document, we want to support our allies in preserving the freedom and security of Europe while restoring Europe's civilizational self-confidence and Western identity. And I think we all know what he's talking about there. We are heading into the Christmas season, and we know that the famous Christmas markets in Europe in many places have been canceled or otherwise have to be protected because of the risk of terror attacks. You know, Brussels has put on a faceless nativity scene because to show the faces of prophets is considered obscene in Islam. And, of course, the display still copped the usual Free Palestine graffiti. And not surprisingly, Trump's policy talked about, in light of all of this, migration policies that are transforming the continent and creating strife and the loss of national identities and self-confidence. Well, indeed, what more can you say about it when, say, Paris can no longer hold New Year's Eve celebrations on the Champs-Élysées because the government does not control public spaces anymore? All it seems to have control over now in Europe, the government, is the virtual space, where liberal values of free speech and argument and debate have given way to a situation where Europeans are regularly visited by the police for expressing their political opinions on social media. And it is a fair question, of course, given all of that, how Europe expects to rouse its people to, as it wishes to, fend off Russia, when it has spent so much of the recent past doing everything it could to run down the idea of a distinct European people and civilization, in the process destroying national pride. You got to ask the question, how are the Europeans going to raise an army when, at least from the outside, it looks like Europe doesn't even know what it would be fighting for? Well, as promised, joining me now is the Wall Street Journal's editor-at-large, Gerard Baker. Gerard, thanks so much for joining me, and we've got to have a chat about this national security strategy, which says that continental Europe has been losing its share of GDP. It's down. It's having all sorts of cultural issues, migration issues. Is this a Dear John letter, or is this an intervention?
Well, James, it's actually an intervention, I think, and particularly an intervention against the European Union. I think it is important to understand there's a distinction here between the European Union and European nations and European peoples. And this has been a phenomenon for a very, very long time. The European Union is an undemocratic institution. Its leadership is not directly elected. Decisions are made very, very remote from the people of the European countries. And the European Union has, over the last 25 years, been a kind of an avatar of this progressive left-wing thinking, whether it be on climate, the radical green policies that they've pushed, net zero, disastrously for many, many European countries, whether it's been on issues like the whole issue of gender and diversity and all of those things. So there has been, the European Union has been, while it was supposed to be an economic club, James, of countries that relatively wealthy countries that came together for the benefit of trade and for the benefit of closer integration, it has become an institutionalized pillar of this sort of woke progressive ideology. And I think what Trump is trying to do in this national security strategy is to say, look, this is not in the interest of Europe. Mass immigration, where European civilization is being essentially snuffed out by huge amounts of immigration, this woke program, the climate stuff, the fact that the Europeans have not been willing to defend themselves. It's saying, wake up, Europe, and actually, there is a Europe out there which is the cradle of civilization, which can continue, can resume its role as a vital ally in the fight for our civilizational goals, but the European Union is not it.
And it's interesting, Gerard, because I read a lot of the commentary around this document, and people are accusing Trump of cutting Europe loose. But what I get out of this is actually something that I've said for quite some time, which is that Donald Trump is actually quite a big fan of the old Europe that he thinks of as kind of, I guess, pre-Tony Blair Europe, pre-Tony Blair Great Britain. And we see this with his affection for the late Queen Elizabeth and in many other sort of areas. This is not so much a transactional play, but a wake-up call, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it is. Look, I mean, there are aspects of this that I think are concerning. I think, and there are aspects of this document that I think are quite contradictory. On the one hand, it talks about seeking a kind of a collaborative economic relationship with China, whereas it seems to have a confrontational relationship with the European Union. So, and then the other thing we should also say about this, James, is we shouldn't take these documents too seriously. These are the documents that come out once every 4 years, the beginning of a new administration. They're kind of, rather than a sort of a white paper, a policy document, they're a kind of expression of political views of the people who happen to be writing the document. But yeah, when it comes to they're not wrong on the European Union on this case. They're not wrong that Europe has just failed to defend its own civilization for decades. Look. I grew up in England. When Britain was a member of the European Union, I grew up under Margaret Thatcher's when Margaret Thatcher was prime minister. Back then, the West stood for something, right? Britain stood for something. It stood for standing up for our values and our ideals. Steadily, over the last 25 years, it has become Britain, when it was in the European Union. Of course, Britain left a few years ago, but now the rest of the European Union has become this vehicle for these ideals and values that really are at odds with what Europe traditionally used to stand for. And I don't think it's a bad thing to call that out and say, time is running out, Europe. Your demographics are terrible. Your economy is terrible. You've got no productivity growth. You've got massive welfare states. You've got no ability to defend yourselves with your own defense. Get your act together. Pull yourself together. Get some sort of sense of restoration of the ideals on which let's face it, much of world civilization, including Australia's, was built.
Well, exactly, Gerard. And this is what's so interesting to me because, you mentioned migration a moment ago. And it seems to me that what's happened here is that Donald Trump has absolutely shouldered open the Overton window on what you can say and talk about in terms of migration, including this idea that there is a distinct English people, a distinct American people, a distinct Australian people, for that matter, and that cultural compatibility matters. We're seeing this debate taking off suddenly in Australia as well. Would you say that this is actually a positive contribution, when you get beyond some of the rhetoric he uses, to say that actually you can have these honest conversations about who works and who doesn't when you put people together in a nation?
Yeah, I think that's right. Look, the United States has long been, although in some respects it too has gone off the rails a bit, but the United States has long been a model of how to integrate different cultures, right? People from different civilizations, different background. I think Australia has too, to be fair, to some extent, although I think, again, Australia's gone off the rails a bit in the last decade or so. But the United States, and the reason it worked in the United States and continues to work, not as well as it did, is because people come to the United States and accept American culture and civilization, accept the values of America, what it stands for. They accept the principles of liberal democracy and capitalism and all of the things that you associate with America. In Europe, what happened, James, is that, especially in Britain, where I come from, the British elites for years and years and years basically said to people, come into our country. It was kind of a legacy of empire, especially from the subcontinent. Come into Britain. We owe you this. And by the way, when you come here, you don't have to follow our rules. You don't have to follow our values, our system. You don't have to believe in it at all. You can establish your own little cultural communities. You can have your kind of Muslim community and your, whatever kind of other particular types of ideals and values that you're doing in different parts of the country. That is the way to break up a country. By all means, welcome immigrants, but say to immigrants, look, first of all, we're going to put a control on the number of immigrants. We're not going to let them in willy-nilly, as the British have done for the last few years. But say to them, yeah, you're welcome here, but you're welcome here only if you subscribe to our not just our laws and our rules but our values and our principles and our ideals. And you have to believe in Britain or France or Germany, whatever. The European countries have created this system whereby this multiculturalism, where they've in many cases have literally, visibly, consciously degraded their own historic culture and background and allowed immigrants to establish their own, or to import their own culture, their own values, and their own ideals. And that is the way, frankly, to strife and ultimately to disintegration.
Gerard, thank you so much. Exactly right. And who would have thought that Donald Trump would have wound up being, I guess, the best friend in the long run that perhaps the Europeans never knew they had?
Make Europe great again.
Now, don't go away, because we've got the great Kara Markowitz up in a tick. But first, there's been a really grim situation lately with Candace Owens. Remember her? Well, among other things, she's been spreading some fairly bonkers conspiracy theories about murdered conservative activist Charlie Kirk. And Charlie's widow, Erica, well, she's not happy, and she has been doing the rounds with this message to Candace when talking to CBS's Barry Weiss, who, by the way, has been brought in to clean up that media outlet.
The podcaster Candace Owens, okay? At one time, a friend of Charlie's, at one time, an employee of Turning Point. She has been one of the main peddlers of these conspiracies, and she is making a huge amount of money on it. She is building her business off of these lies. What do you want to say to her and the other people that are putting these lies out into the world right now?
Stop. That's it. That's all I have to say. Stop.
Doesn't get any clearer than that.